Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to wait just a couple more moments until noon for everyone to log in. But welcome to today's program. And thank you for joining us for the basics of Chester County property research. Before we get started, I'd like to mention that the Chester County History Center has several upcoming events that may be of interest to you. They have walking tours of the historic Oakland Cemetery in Westchester, as well as a virtual event in May entitled A Most Gallant Resistance, the Delaware River Campaign of 1777. Finally, if you have any questions during the program, please put them in the chat box and we'll do our best to answer them by the end of today's program. So we have a good number of the registrants logged in, so we're going to go ahead and get started with the program. I'd like to introduce Cliff Parker. He's the director here of the Chester County Archives and Records Services. Cliff?
Welcome, everyone. I'm glad you could be with us here this afternoon. Starting out, I just want to mention that everything that I do go over with you today is available in our property research guide in actually more extensive detail. That guide is linked in your handout, and Stacy will put it in the chat box. And all the referenced websites and online sources that I go over that you'll see pop up throughout the slides are also in your handout. So don't worry about writing down all those URLs. So before I begin, I'll just stop my video so you don't have to see my floating head throughout the talk. To begin with, I just want to mention up front that we are talking about property research, basically the history of the land on which you are researching using county records. And what I mean by that is that we're not solely focusing on house research. And I know that many of you probably are interested in that specific subject, but there's a reason why we were looking at land as opposed to buildings. And that's because county records as a whole are more interested in the history of the land, basically the ownership of the land and its overall assessed value. I know today we're used to basically anytime we want to put up a fence or add an addition, we have to go through a permit process. That process, which we are all used to now, basically came into place in the second half of the 20th century. And those records that are generated are municipal records, not county records. So what we're going to focus on is building a chain of title, basically a list of ownership of your property from the current date all the way back to the proprietary or state government, when the first individual received legal ownership of your property. Once you have that information, excuse me, those names and dates will help you use other resources to contextualize the history of your property and also help document the people and the buildings that exist on the land. So as I mentioned, the primary goal today is learning how to construct a chain of title. So those of us who bought and sold property understand that when we do so, we generate a deed, basically legally transferring our property from one person to the other. That deed is recorded on the county level at the Recorder of Deeds office. So the deed itself will become the building block for our chain of title. The great news is that most of those resources are now accessible online. So for the most part, you don't actually have to travel to Westchester to look up these records. So as I mentioned, a chain of title basically means a history of your land, basically ownership from the first individual who owned it down to the current ownership today. And the most recent records you're going to find are going to be still located in the county offices that generated them or recorded them. Eventually, when you get to the older stuff, that's where we come into play at the county archives. And then when you finally hit the patent, which is basically the original deed to your property, the first deed, those records are going to be at the Pennsylvania State Archives. So where do you want to start? So my suggestion, and where I really recommend everybody begin, is with the assessment office. At the assessment office, they have a great system called Chesco Views, which is is the tax parcel system overlaid on Google Earth. This is an image of the page, and I'm going to get back to that in a second. But a few things that you should know before we tackle Chesco Views. Full street addresses didn't exist before the mid-20th century for most of Chester County. That means there's no easy way to find the entire history of your property just knowing your street address. And even for areas like in boroughs where street addresses were in place earlier, house numbers changed fairly frequently. So even there, it won't be useful to you. The tax parcel system itself wasn't created until the 1960s. So your current tax parcel number, or UPI, that didn't come into play to the second half of the 20th century. In terms of how that may affect your research, if you're researching a cemetery or church where the last known transaction to your property occurred well before the 1960s, Chesco Views will not be of assistance to you. No one county office's records will provide complete information on your property. So as I mentioned, you're going to probably start at various offices. Like here, we're starting at assessment, and then we're going to go to recorder deeds and then archives. So be prepared to move from one location to another to discover the records you need. And knowing your township and borough boundary histories is very important, especially when you go back in time. If you currently live in Phoenixville, when you research your property, eventually you're going to realize you're in Schuylkill Township. And then even going further back, you're in Charlestown Township. Your property hasn't moved, but the township boundaries have shifted over time. So it will help you kind of know what to look out for as you move back in time. So going back to Chesco Views, this is the main screen for Chesco Views. And I'm going to enable my pointer here to help us navigate it. The first area you're going to go to is the magnifying glass up here in the right corner. When you select that, it'll bring up a search box. You have multiple ways to search for your property. Address being the easiest, because most of us will have that information. You can also look by owner or UPI. UPI is your tax parcel number. So once you put that information in, here we put in the street address, and that brings us to our current property. This is the Government Services Center where we're located. You can see it outlined the property, it zooms in on the map, and it provides this information down here. What you want to do is click on this area. When you do so, it'll highlight or basically shade in the tax parcel, but also will bring up this information box. The next thing you're going to click to get to where we want to go is right here, More. And this provides the current parcel detail. And this is where the history basically of the transactions of that property are going to pop up. So as I mentioned, this system only started in the 60s. So you're not going to have any transactions that are going to go before the 60s. And for this particular parcel, the earliest deed that they have on record for it is 1971. Now, depending on how thorough you want to be, if you want to start with your current deed and go all the way back, you can do that, or you can basically start with the earliest deed that they have on record. So for the example going forward, I'm going to follow this reference here. One thing I'm going to note to you, terminology is going to change here a little bit depending on the time period you're in. So if you see the difference here in the books, you see 1936 and then you see V39. Well, why are they different? This is called a record book. Starting in the 1980s, the Recorder of Deeds office put all of their instruments together, meaning deeds and mortgages and satisfactions, into what they called record books that are just numbered sequentially. Before the 80s, they were separated out. So you had a separate series for deed books, a separate series for mortgages, and they used an alphanumeric system. So this is Book V, Series 39 in the deed books. So this is what we're going to trace going back. So now that we have a deed book and page, we're going to go to the Recorder of Deeds office. We're going to go under their record search system here. And then when you at this point, you have two options. Their records are split between time period into two different systems. The Eagle Web is for records that are for images of records that are recorded between 1994 till the present day. And then you have the IQS system, which goes all the way back to the earliest recorded deeds till 1993. When you click on either of those buttons, you're going to come to a disclaimer page. They're standard for basically all of the county websites you're going to use online records for. You can just acknowledge. You do not have to register. You can just use the public login over here. And this is an example of the search engine for the Eagle Web. Because you have the reference and page number, by the time you hit here, this is the area that you're going to concern yourself with. You're just going to put in your reference here, and then this will bring up the search selection screen. And to view the image of the deed itself, you just hit view image over here. And what that will do is bring up the image on the bottom part of the screen, and you just scroll down to look at the image. But because our reference was before 1994, remember it was V39 in 1971, we're going to use the IQS system. And this is the search screen for the IQS system. You're going to note a few weird bits of language here. You see e-film reader, load film. This system is based off of digitized microfilm, and they still treat the microfilm rolls basically the same way they would, if this was microfilm as opposed to a digital image. So once you're on the screen, you're going to put the book up here. And in this instance, remember it was V39, which will stick up in this box here, and then we'll have load film. One thing to note that, if you're using deeds, sometimes you'll see the reference, you'll see V-39. Do not put the dashes, just put the alpha and then the number. Do not put any characters in between. When you get back in time, when you get to the first series, this number here is a series. So basically it has series 1 all the way to 39. When you hit the first series, you have to use the 1. So even if you see just dbook V with nothing after it, you need to include the 1 to indicate the first series to bring it up. Once you put the dbook up here, you hit load film, and it'll bring you to that roll of film. And when you get there, that's when you put the page number up in this box here. The thing to keep in mind too is that the page number here will not necessarily match the instrument, the deed page, the book page itself. You want to verify that you're on the right page because it may be a few pages off. So that's how you get to the deeds themselves. Now, to make life easier or even more complicated, depending on the way you look at this, there's two other options for dbook images for the earlier period. On our website, we have digital images available between 1688 up to 1918. The difference between what we have and what is at the Recorder Deeds office is that our images were scanned directly from the original book, so the quality is a little better. And that's especially useful if you're going back with all that handwriting and it's hard to read the digital images on the IQS system. The other issue is that in the first series, there are 2 dbooks that are missing in the IQS system that are available on our website. So in our system, you will go to the deed page. Again, all of the links directly to these pages are in the handout. It automatically comes in on the index page. All you have to do is select the images page, and it'll bring our Laserfiche system up here, where you just have to select the deed book in the list, and that'll bring up the images for that deed book. And one final place that you can look up deeds is familysearch.org. This is a genealogy site where this site comes in handy. It's not for the deed books themselves, even though they do have them up to 1903. They have a full index up to 1922, which is only available on their website. So if you need to look up an index, which we'll talk about later, this site may be the place you need to go. The other feature that they have is if you're looking for deeds in some of the surrounding counties, like Philadelphia or Delaware County, they also are available on this site. So to get there, you will have to sign up for a free account to view the images. You're going to go over here to the search, the catalog box, and then under the search terms, you're going to put location. They're very particular in the way they want you to put this information in here. So you have to do United States, Pennsylvania, Chester, or Delaware, or Philadelphia, wherever you're looking. And then that will bring up a list of resources they have. You've got to scroll down until you get to the land and property records. So now you know how to get to the deeds. The next step is understanding how to extract and interpret them once you're there. The good news is that deed language hasn't changed for centuries. Every deed you look at from current day all the way back to 1680s, you typically uses the same language. There are variations here and there. For the most part, it's standard boilerplate legal jargon. When you look at a deed like this, you can easily pick out what's unique to this particular deed and what's basically standard language by what's being printed on the form as opposed to what is being handwritten. So the first part of a deed is what we call the introduction. And here, of course, we capture important information to constructing a chain of title. The first thing, of course, is the date. Remember, we want to know who owns it and when they own it. So here we learn that this transaction took place on April 1st, 1873. Oop, didn't mean to hit that one. The next part we want to know is who the seller is. And in this instance, it's Robert Lynch of Cecil County and his wife, Elizabeth. Now, Robert Lynch, we might call the seller just in layman's terms, but he's what is referred to as the grantor. So when you use indexes later, the grantor index is the seller index. The buyer in this instance is John Gregg, and John Gregg is, again, buyer. We call him the buyer, but in legal jargon, he is the grantee. The next thing that we want to make note of is the consideration. This is the amount of money that is being paid for the property at the time. This isn't the best indicator of actual real value because in many instances you'll see properties being sold for $1 being subject to other conveyances that don't readily speak to the value of the property being sold. The next bit of information that's important, and this is especially important for people who are looking to document their house, is the word messuage. Messuage is the sole word in a deed that indicates that a dwelling house exists on the property. Now, of course, that doesn't mean it's your dwelling house. It could be, any dwelling house. It could also mean that there's more than one dwelling house. But the only thing this is telling us is that there is a dwelling house on the property being sold. But there is a huge caveat here. It's common practice to insert that word in this area, but it is not legally required. And why that's important to understand is that its absence or inclusion isn't 100% foolproof. People make mistakes. There are clerical errors. Somebody may omit that word even if there's a dwelling house on the property being sold. So it's a good indicator, but you can't solely rely on that word. The next bit of information is the township. And again, this comes in, knowing the history of your township comes in handy because here we are in Elk Township. If you go, 20 years earlier than this or 30 years earlier than this, you're going to be in East Nottingham Township. So when that change happens, if you know that the history of that area, then you're okay, that I'm still tracing the same property that I was before. There's just the township boundary has changed. And the next thing that you're going to make note of is the metes and bounds. I'm going to go over this a little bit more later in the talk, but it is important to note changes in the metes and bounds as you go back in time. The easiest way to do that is when you come to the acreage. So if the acreage changes, you know that a new survey probably has taken place before the sale. it's not the easiest thing to delve into. Basically, the meets and bounds are the product of the survey that was created to lay out your property. So it's telling you from a tree to a stone to a road. So it's kind of sounds like gibberish to most people, but once you understand how to extract that information and then at least get a sense of the shape of the property, it really allows you to understand the full scope of and history of your property, and will also help you get around problems that you're going to encounter when you're actually doing the research and you find a break in title, which I'll be going over in a bit. The most important bit of information from a deed is in the recital clause, and this is going to tell you how the current owner acquired the property. And with that information, you're going to basically work back at another step, another chain in your chain of title. That's what you're going to use for the most part to get back in time. So after that, the good news is you can mostly ignore what you find in the deed because 90% of it is boilerplate legal jargon. It has no bearing or anything unique in concern of your chain of title. The one thing I will warn you of, a lot of people kind of get stuck on, is that this paragraph here always mentions buildings. And sometimes, especially early on, they'll even go down the list of them. They'll talk about dwellings and barns and stables and spring houses. This is just standard legal language. It is basically telling us that anything that is currently on the property or that could be on the property is being sold. It is not saying that any of that is on the property being sold. So ignore it, in essence. So now that you extract that information from the deed and you work your way back in time, this is an example of what a chain of title looks like. This is the title for the GSC. And as you can see, we all go all the way back to William Penn from the last recorded transaction to the county of Chester. And you can see we use the standard stuff that I just went over, record books, which are basically deed books, but then you're going to start seeing other things here: court proceedings, sheriff's docket, wills, unrecorded. So in the best of circumstances, every deed for your property has been recorded and you're not going to have a break in title, but that is a rare occasion. Most properties are going to have breaks in title. I always like to think of each property as unique. It's like a thumbprint. You're not going to encounter the same things that your neighbor is going to encounter when they're doing their chain of title. And so what I'm going to do next, I'm going to basically give you a sense of the types of breaks of chains that you will encounter, but you will not necessarily encounter them yourself. My goal here is just to get you to understand that you're going to be frustrated at some point, but there are resources out there to get you around that. And at this moment, I do want to make clear to you that the staff in this office are here to help you. If you can come on in, and we'll help you get around that break in their title. If you can't, we do offer virtual appointments, so sign up for one of those, and we'll see if we can get you past that point. But for most part, most breaks in the chain of title, there is a workaround and a solution to your problem. So one of the biggest breaks in the chain is through sheriff sales. Sheriff sales occur, of course, because an individual has lost their property through debt or unpaid taxes. And the court requires the sheriff to go out and sell the property to pay the debtors. In general, there are no details about how the original owner acquired the property. Basically, you'll get back to the fact that the court or the sheriff sold that land, but you will not get any information on how the original owner actually acquired it. In the indexes, the sheriff then becomes the seller, grantor. So the original owner kind of just disappears. And the sheriff does have his own set of deed dockets, which is something that will fill in the information that you've lost in your chain of title. One positive thing that occurs through a sheriff sale is that there is always a public sale notice. So for those, again, who are looking for the history of the buildings on their property, if something goes up for sheriff sale, typically there's going to be a very nice write-up in the newspaper, because what they're trying to do is make sure they can get enough potential buyers to come out and bid on it so the price goes up. And that basically has been the way things have been done since the 1700s. So as an example, you can see here that, we're working back and we get to the recital clause of this deed, it being the same Messuagen tract of land, which Ezekiel Leonard, High Sheriff, did seize as the property of Thomas Mercer and sell to the current owner, Thomas Traveller, in August of 1789. But you'll see there's no recital clause, no deed reference, nowhere to tell us to go. So this is a common break in title. The next kind that you'll encounter, and probably just as frequently, is through inheritance. The original owner died in possession of the property. Once again, there's no details of how the original owner acquired the property. And the other thing to remember is that if, say, the original owner died and left it to his heir, that will itself is technically the legal transfer of property. So that means there's not going to be a recorded deed for that transaction. Executors, or if someone died with a will, administrators for someone who died without a will, or the heirs now become the seller or grantor of that property. And again, just like with sheriff's deeds, or sheriff's breaks in title, you have the sheriff dockets. For inheritance, you also have wills and administration files to rely on. And once again, there's a good chance that you're going to find a property sale notice when a property is sold from an estate. And here's an example of where that happens. You have, of course, the first indication is you've got an administrator who's selling the property. It's the property of Abraham Detweiler, and Abraham Detweiler was in his lifetime lawfully seized in his demesne of a certain plantation of tract of land situate in the township of Vincent aforesaid, containing 139 acres. That's it. We don't know how Abraham acquired it, don't know when he acquired it. All we know is that he acquired it. And then the last set I'll highlight are what I call best intentions. In these cases, a lot of times the original owner didn't bother to record his original purchase. And while this is more common in the 18th and 19th century, you're still going to find occasional people in the early part of the 20th century that just didn't bother to record their deed. It was required by law, but the farther back in time you go, the higher the chance that someone didn't record it. And it could be a number of factors, but mostly it was because of the inconvenience traveling back and forth between the county seat or paying the filing charges. These deeds may provide you with details of the original purchase, but will not provide you with a deed book and page. So they might say that so-and-so received it from so-and-so on such and such a date, but they will not even mention where it's recorded or if it was intended to be recorded. And they will use phrases like intended to be recorded or acquired through sundry good conveyances. Sundry good conveyance is usually the death knell. You could almost guarantee that it's an unrecorded deed. It's the trust me, I legally own it, phrase. For these instances, you want to check indexes for recording after the date of the instrument you're currently looking at. So if someone does say, I intend to record this, and the transaction was 1870, but the transaction you're looking at is 1880, then the recording is going to have to occur after 1880. And another thing that people have a tendency to do, so say they saved up 2 or 3 unrecorded deeds for 20 years. They finally get to the recorder's office. They do what I call as a deed dump. They dump all the unrecorded transactions at the same time, and the clerk will basically write them into the deed books one after the other. So check before and after the current deed, because sometimes you'll get lucky and you'll find the missing unrecorded deed right before the one you're looking at. And then in the end, be very prepared for an unrecorded deed, because they do pop up, especially in the earlier periods. And just for the other ones, here's an example. The said recited indenture intended to be recorded with no deed book and page references, so you're left hanging. So to reforge those links, there are a few things you want to keep in mind. What information do you have? And in most instances, you will have a few pieces of information. One, you're almost always going to know who the last owner was, the person that broke that chain. So you'll have a name. You also need to know when that occurred. So you're going to have the date. Like in the case of Abraham Detweiler, we know when his estate sold it, so he basically bought it before that date. And then how did that break occur? So was it through inheritance? Was it through a sheriff's deed? Was it through an unrecorded deed? That will determine what resources you're going to go to try to get around your current problem. The first step in all these situations is you're going to go to the index, because you're going to have a name, and you're going to have at least, you know, a date to start working with. So the indexes are in several different locations, depending on when your break occurs. The first place, if you're looking in the 20th century, or at least for the last 3/4 of the 20th century, you're going to use the Eagle system. Now, when you look at it, it says that it starts in 1905, but those real dates are between 1928 to the present. And I will point out that currently there is no online index for 1922 and 1928. So if your break occurs in that small window of time, you might actually have to end up going to the Recorder of Deeds office to look in the original index. If your break occurs between 1688 and 1865, you can use our index. And why our index is better for that period is because we actually index from the original. So we took out original owners. So instead of just the sheriff or the executor appearing in the grantor index, the original owner also appears in that index. It also provides you the property locations. So if you're looking, you know, you come up with several references and looking for a piece of property in a specific township, that will help narrow down the right transaction. And then last but not least is the FamilySearch.org. They can fill in the gaps between 1865 and 1922. The second step, if you go into those indexes and you don't discover a transaction, which will happen, there are other resources to use. And I'm not going to have time enough to go through all of these, but I'm just going to highlight some of the ones that are the easiest to use and the most helpful. So mortgages act basically just like deeds, at least as far as their structure. Here's a breakdown by period. Before 1776, they're recorded in deed books. You also have people going to the General Loan Office in Philadelphia, which handed out loans in the 18th century. We do have an index here, but the originals still exist at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania and at the Philadelphia City Archives. And then after that, the mortgages are in mortgage books, which are accessible here and at the Recorder of Deeds. And just as an example, as you can see, it looks exactly like a deed, and it typically will provide you with a recital clause, so you can get back on track if the mortgage itself is recorded. And think about, you know, people's vested interest in recording mortgages, because if you're the one lending the money, you know, if that person defaults, you want a recorded deed, a recorded mortgage at the Recorder of Deeds office. So mortgages are much more consistently recorded than deeds themselves, especially in the early period. And as I mentioned, sheriff's deeds, you have access to sheriff's deed dockets beginning in 1776. If a break occurs before 1776, you also have a resource called Complete Execution and Inquisitions. These records are at the archives here with us, and we do have a full index on our website. As an example here, this is from the sheriff's deed docket, kind of gives bare bones information, but you will get the name of the person the property was seized from, so you'll have another name to go back to the index to look for. And just as a bonus, this is just a copy of a sheriff's sale. This is the typical notice that would have gone in the newspaper when a property was seized by the sheriff. And as you can see here, it talks about the buildings themselves. 2.5-story single brick house with 6 rooms and an attic, frame, shed, kitchen attached, front porch, etc. And here we break down, you can find the sales notice is in Philadelphia before the main newspaper in Westchester pops up in the early part of the 1800s. And then it's going to be in the Westchester newspapers. And we have them in sales dockets from 1881 to 1974 at the archives. Another set of records that will be useful for breaking a chain of title are tax records. Basically, they're only really useful between 1800 and 1983. And just as an example, since we're kind of running short of time, if you're using taxes and this is spelled out in the property research guide better than I'll be able to explain here, so you're working back with the person who you know owns the property. When that transaction occurs within the tax year, the assessor generally notes the change. And here you can see Isaac, I can't read that today, Harker, or the original owner was crossed out and the new owner, Larkin Way, was put on top. So it's a way that you can actually try to get another name to get yourself back in time. And wills and administration. Before 1714, they're recorded in Philadelphia. Many are still recorded in Philadelphia before the Revolutionary War, and this is specifically applicable to people along the Schuylkill. So people researching properties in Coventry and East Vincent and East Pikeland and Schuylkill and Phoenixville may encounter a deed being recorded in a will recorded in Philadelphia. There are abstracts for this entire period, so it makes it easier for searching for names. From 1714 to 1923, they're here. After that, they're still at the Register of Wills office. And here's an example. This guy nicely put in lots of details in his will. So as he's giving out his bequest to his sons, John gets property in West Goshen that he purchased from Nathaniel Hollingsworth. In town, like here, he purchased property from James Painter. So you see, you can potentially get a lot of detail out of a will file. Now, we'll circle back to meets and bounds. No property stays the same over time. And for me, those of you who truly want to understand the evolution of your property, it's important. It's especially important if you are documenting the structures in several different ways. And here's a kind of a rundown of when you should plot. When you research your tract and you bump into multiple tracts, like you have three differently described tracts in one transaction, you don't know which of those tracts your house is located on, so you need to discover that. And the only way to really do that is to plot them out. The change in tract size. So when the physical description changes, again, where does your house sit on that? So and it will change over time. As you go back in time, as the tract gets bigger and bigger and bigger and gets chopped up in different ways, how do you stay aware of where your house resides on those larger tracts? And then, of course, if you lost the chain, say you're looking for that Abraham Detweiler and he buys 5 different tracts, and you have to determine which one of those 5 tracts fits into the last known description you have when you were following the chain of title. If you plot them out, you can figure out which one is relevant to your research. The good news is that there are software that can help you plot it out to make your life easier. There's Track Plotter, which is free. It's an online browser-based software. And then there's also Deed Mapper, which is paid software. You can also just do it the old-fashioned way with a protractor and graph paper. And just as an example, when you take the meets and bounds out, your primary goal is to extract the direction. So if something says it's north 80 degrees west, you basically shorthand that to N80W, and then you get to the length. The length are typically done in perches, and perches are 16.5 feet. And then last but not least, you want to take out the reference points. Anytime it mentions a bounding neighbor, a road, or a creek, it'll help you place that property in its proper context. And sorry there. Just an example, we were working on a project in London Britton Township, and this property had a mill and a dwelling house. They were trying to kind of pinpoint the date of construction. So this piece here is the property we're following, and it stayed consistently the same as you go back. But in 1829, it basically becomes part of a larger tract. So in 1829, the piece that we're following is here. And as you can see, here's the dwelling house, here's the mill. When you go back to 1805, this was the entirety of the property. And then you go back even further, 1789, see how much of it expands. And then even further back in 1732, you can see it here. And here again is the dwelling house. Now, why this is important, other than I think maps are neat and I think it's wonderful, watch what happens when you run that line. They wanted to know which of these tracks they were originally on to pinpoint when they would have likely been constructed. And you can see they're all on the tract that's purchased in 1720. Here's the house, here's the mill. So, it's a lot of work. If you encounter issues, mapping it out can really give you a good perspective of what's going on in that neighborhood. Which then leads me to maps. You also have map resources out there. Mapworks.com has a ton of Chester County maps on there. The best, I think, in the standard, which maybe most of you are already familiar with, is Brio's Farm Atlas, because it covers the entire county and it has property lines. It's a great resource. The Franklin atlases are great as well, but they didn't cover the entire county. And there are also several railroad atlases for those people who live basically on the main line or the Pennsylvania Railroad. There are a ton of resources in the late 19th, early 20th century. In addition, you have reconstructed property atlases. We're working on the 1770 Chester County Property Atlas, which should be done by the summer. So the entire county will be available. You have other resources like at the Tredyffrin Easttown Historical Society. So Mike Bertram has done an amazing job mapping the townships that I have listed there. And then if you come into the office, we have several non-online resources, like for Euclid and Upper Euclid. Estelle Kremer's work for the Pikelands, East, the Vincents, and the Coventrys. So there's a lot of things to discover that can help you back on track. And then there are resources at the Chester County History Center. One of the best collections they have is for this type of research is the Reed Gordon Title Company. You may discover that someone has done a lot of the legwork for you already. And they also have unrecorded deeds. So if you bump into an unrecorded deed here, when you're doing your chain of title, it may very well be resting in the collections over at the History Center. So when you get back to the patent, you've reached the end, right? Well, not always. You should be very suspicious if you reach the patent in the 19th century or the late 18th century. The patent, the way the process works with provincial government. So you were interested in, say, 100 acres of land in West Marlborough Township. So you take out a warrant with the provincial and then later state government. Say, I want 100 acres of land in West Marlborough. They would then send out a surveyor who would get the meets and bounds, basically, what we were talking about earlier. And with that information, that individual should have then returned to patented the property. The problem is many people went up to the survey part, but didn't necessarily get to the patent part. So what happens is people start selling their what is called warrant rights, and they could sell their warrant rights for, there's instances where they've done so for a century. So you might have a whole century worth of history for your property that isn't going to be picked up in our records because it's pre-patent, before basically the state and provincial government gave legal title to your piece of land. So the first thing, like if you hit a patent, is to actually look at the patent, and they are available on familysearch.org, and the direct link to them is in your handout. A lot of times that patent will run down any warrant history that's there, but not always. We also have, if you look on the Property Research Guide webpage that we have an article on land, basically on that particular issue. I'm having trouble remembering the title of the article. The Land of Peaceable Possession, that's what it's called. That basically works through what you're going to run into and certain ways around or trying to kind of reconnect that history. But there are resources at the state government, at the Pennsylvania State Archives, that I suggest you research once you hit the patent. And with that, I will take your questions.
Cliff, we have a question from Dave, who asked if does tract plotter account for changes in magnetic declination since the 1700s to correct the bearing in degrees minutes per second?
No, absolutely not. Nothing does to my knowledge. And tract plotter is really basic. It fundamentally it will give you the shape of your property, but will not take into account any of those variations. Yeah, that's one of the frustrating things. Like when we're mapping for the 1777 atlas, we have to assume what ends up being the accepted boundary in the 19th century is what is, in essence, like, because we place pre-change, surveys next to after the change surveys. Nothing fits, but in the end, there's pretty much like there's no legal mechanism by which people iron that out. It was just assumed that the boundary was here, and that's what basically was recognized later on.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. And that was I think the only other question that we had. Is there anyone else that would like to ask a question of Cliff? Thank you, Cliff. That was excellent. Okay. I'm not seeing any other questions, and some people are dropping off, but as Cliff had mentioned, you can reach us here at the archives. We're open for walk-ins Monday to Friday, 9 to 4. You can reach us by phone, by email. You can also ask an archivist. We have virtual appointments as well. But please, don't hesitate to reach out with any questions. We're here to help. For sure.
Right. We are.
So thank you so much for everybody attending. Cliff, thank you for an excellent presentation. And I think everyone, and we will get this link to the video sent out so that you can listen to it, as well as any other questions. You can reach out to us to that email.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
All right. Thank you, everyone.